Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for an episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, I'm ashamed to admit that after Sanders made his comments in defense of the Cuban and Nicaraguan dictatorships in 2016, I still voted for him in the Democratic primary from Reason.com, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added, well, I'm glad this person finally was able to get rid of the brainworm that is socialist ideology. It's scary that even people who have physically experienced it can be brainwashed and supporting socialism by extreme left-wing echo chambers. And yeah, that's an article from Reason about how I think a Venezuelan, my family fed socialism, I voted for Bernie Sanders. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that, just because, even if you've lived under socialism, you might like it when it's marketed a different way. I personally voted for Bernie in the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries because I was more blue-pilled back then. But, it just goes to show you that, even if someone markets themselves good, just because they market themselves good doesn't mean they're actually going to be a good leader. Just look at Donald Trump. He markets himself very good, very well, and he won the presidential election 2 of the past 3 times. He even won the popular vote the last time. And it just goes to show you that, politicians, it's all just really marketing rather than actual, whatever their actual politics and principles. And it just goes to show you, I think we just gotta get rid of forced collectivist politics in general. I think if people want Bernie to be their president or Trump to be their president, they should be able to, but, they shouldn't be forced to have them as their leader if they don't want to. Next we have Senator Lindsey Graham dies at 71 after a brief and sudden illness from NBCNews.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I responded to this on another comment on the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. Didn't know he was sick. He was definitely one of the biggest neocon warmongers in Congress. Hopefully SC gets a better senator in his seat, but I guess I probably would have said the same thing for his predecessor, Strom Thurmond. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Lindsey Graham, but, I personally don't believe we should be celebrating anyone's deaths. I think that's very anti-Christian, and I think, I do try and live by Christian principles as much as possible. And yeah, personally, if you want to celebrate Lindsey Graham's death, you should be able to. But I personally didn't care for him and how up Israel's ass he was. He said if he wants to go, I'm with Israel till my dying day, not you. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for him, but I'm not really going to celebrate his death because I think that's kind of trashy. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, it's now clear that Democrats must pack the Supreme Court from MS.now, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and they added, court packers are authoritarian scum. And I would agree with their statement that court packers are authoritarian scum. It just goes to show you it doesn't really matter, who's it doesn't really matter how many people are on the court. Or I guess it kind of, it doesn't really matter, who's on the court. It just matters, who has the ability to enforce what. And a lot of times the court, they can make whatever rulings they want to, but oftentimes they lack the ability to enforce it, since the judicial branch doesn't enforce the law, the executive branch does, yeah, so personally they can make whatever rulings they want to, but I personally think, they don't have the ability to really enforce those rulings, so I think people get too caught up in that. Personally, I think the libertarian position is at this point just get rid of the Supreme Court and the whole judicial branch and legislative branch, because they're really just there to exist. They don't really enforce the law. The executive branch does, and it's not really even the executive branch does it. It's all the alphabet agencies under the umbrella of the executive branch, like the FBI, CIA, NSA, etc., etc. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have another Trump ceasefire with Iran crumbles from TheIntercept.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I would love a ceasefire with Iran, but I don't know how realistic it is, because Israel's the one who really wants to go war with Iran forever, and they're the ones really pulling Trump's strings here, I would say. Well, also because, Trump might not really be even the one making the decisions. It really might be the deep state Israeli bureaucrats, and that's important to remember as well. Next we have Oh Here We Go Again, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump. The Hormuz Strait is open and will remain open for private Iran. We are reinstating the Iranian blockade, so name because it is only stopping Iran ships or customers from entering or leaving. All other countries will have fair and open use of the strait. The USA will be, from this point forward, known as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait, but as such, and as a matter of fairness, will be reimbursed at the rate of 20% on all cargo shipped for any and all costs necessary to do the job of providing safety and security to this very volatile section of the world. The process of information will begin immediately. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, I guess I don't think the U.S. should be involved with keeping the Hormuz Strait open, but Trump got us into this mess with Iran, and if he wants to justify staying there forever, I personally wouldn't care for it, but ultimately that's how the U.S. usually works, regardless of which figurehead president in power. The U.S. has to be the world police, and that's something that I personally don't really care for. Trump said on the campaign trail, America first, and we shouldn't be the world police, but he gets into office and suddenly it's, we need to be the world police, Israel first, and just go to show you, it doesn't really matter who's in the position of power when it comes to the presidency. They're just going to justify being the same globalist warmongers, regardless of what letter is next to their name. Next we have Ben Swanger, Anarcho-Capitalism is a product and expression of collectivism, from hbletter.com, posted by Ryan Blizzard, and they added reprinted from Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections of Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy, ARI 2019. And yeah, personally, I would say anarcho-capitalism, it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's collectivist if it's anarchic, but, certainly when implemented, it might end up being collectivist. I shared a post to the Libertarian, or not, the Anarcho-Capitalism subreddit recently, and I said, this will happen under Anarcho-Capitalism, and it was a screenshot from the Comics Curmudgeon blog, and it was yesterday's Hager the Horrible, and it's the states that the hired goon says to Hager, the king has abolished taxes, and Hager says, looks happy about it, and then the goon says they've been replaced with do what's good for you donation, and Hager says, I'm stealing that line. And yeah, personally, I think that's very much how anarcho-capitalism might actually function. There might be no state, but it's essentially people will use hired goons to reinvent the state. And personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately, someone's always got to have control over force. And personally, I don't really care for the state, but ultimately, if the state's not there, someone else is going to take over on that use of force, whether it be a private enterprise or a voluntary association. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump post video demanding arrest of Bernie Sanders and Zoran Mamdani, criminalize democratic socialism, arrest the leaders and deport them. What are your thoughts? Posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the Ask Anything subreddit. And yeah, personally I don't really care for Bernie and Zoran, but I don't think you should be deporting them or criminalizing them, but ultimately, the state can justify doing whatever it feels like. I'm sure if Bernie said, criminalize MAGA, arrest the leaders, and deport them, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever, but of course, since it's the out group going after the in group, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever. But so, ultimately, it doesn't really matter, though. I think it's all just theater, nothing ever really does seem to happen. And yeah, I personally don't really care for democratic socialism. I think that's, as I said in a previous episode, that's just kind of voting yourself into the gulag. But in many ways, Trump is a democratic socialist himself, and he's not going to arrest and deport himself. So that's very much how, ultimately, they're all, I think, they're all really just democratic socialists, even the ones who are supposedly conservatism. Because as Michael Malice famously said, conservatism is just progressivism driving the speed limit, and Trump is a very good example of that. He's pretty much a 90s, 2000s Democrat, and now suddenly he's the conservative vanguard. It just goes to show you that, they're all really progressives, just some aren't as progressive as the others. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump's tariffs have been particularly costly for small businesses, from Reason.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the conspiracy subreddit. And yeah, that's the next one. That was the last post. Trump's tariffs have been particularly costly for small businesses, from Reason.com, posted by Jerry Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for tariffs. They're just a tax on imported goods. But ultimately, if the state wants to implement any tax it wants to, oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they have the monopoly on legal force to force you to do whatever they want. And if you don't like it, they have the ability to just throw you in jail, and it just goes to show you, I personally don't really care for that, but the state has the authority to justify doing whatever it feels like a lot of the time, and there's nothing you can do about it, really, since they control the courts and the legal system as well. Next, we have Fox News believes Israel over an American congressman with video proof of his claims from Imgur.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-posted on the conspiracy subreddit. And yeah, personally, I would disagree with Fox News there. But ultimately, if Fox News wants to disagree with, wants to believe Israel over Ro Khanna, they should be able to. I personally don't care for how the settlers detained Ro Khanna. But I personally don't think he should have been in there in the first place. Because the Israeli settlers, it's on the other side of the world. It's not the problem of the U.S. And I think the libertarian position is, it's the other side of the world. Let them handle their own problems. Let the U.S. handle its problems. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I wanted to share a post I did from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit as well. Not the one I did about the comic, but about us. This is about something else. Why does the West, a civilization has historically prioritized individualism, revere democracy, an inherently collectivist institution so much? And I added, I would argue that despite coming from the West, the institution of democracy is fundamentally anti-Western. Just because a tyrant is voted in rather than not voted in doesn't mean that it makes him any less of a tyrant. I think that the only reason it's popular are twofold. Due to its age and how it supposedly empowers as many as possible. Ideally, in a true ANCAP society, there would be no forced collectivist democracies, only voluntary collectives that would choose if they wanted to make decisions democratically or not. Thoughts? And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. I personally think, democracy, if you want to do it voluntarily, I think that's fine, but I don't think you should be forced to do it if you don't want to. And right now, if we have the model where the state, you're under whatever state you're under is a territorial umbrella, and you have to obey whatever laws they have. And I personally don't think that's very libertarian. I think the libertarian position is justify doing whatever you want to as long as you're not hurting anyone else. And a lot of laws do go against that. There are a lot of victimless crimes out there. I personally don't think you should be jerking off in public. But, ultimately, if you want to justify doing that, ultimately, that's no one else is getting hurt. I do think it should be stigmatized, but, ultimately, it should be an individual decision whether you do it or not. And, yeah, so that's my thoughts there, and let's see if there's anything new on the subreddit. Looks like there's nothing new. So we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode.